All right, I'm going to start again because I forgot to hit record. So good morning, everyone. My name is Gorman Lee. I am the K-12 Director of Social Studies for the Braintree Public Schools, and I am the co-chair for NERCVirtual 2020. This is our kickoff day. So there's a lot of things that I'm learning on the fly as we are doing this live. And we are actually also on Facebook Live as well. And so today and tomorrow, we're going to be having a series of keynote sessions. And we are very privileged and honored to have our very first keynote for this virtual conference with Ken Davis, who is the author of his new book, Strongman. And he is also best known for his Don't Know Much About book series. And he's come to our conferences in the last couple of years. And he's always drawn a big crowd. He's always had a lot of people really just fascinated to hear him speak. And so we're very, very happy to have him here. So before we move forward, we have a chat where you can write in your questions, just type it in. I will relay those questions to Ken, and then maybe towards the end of the session, we will open up for people to ask questions verbally directly with him. And then I'm also going to be sending you a link towards the end of this session for evaluation feedback form. So yeah, so let's get started here. Without further ado, here is Ken Davis. Welcome. Oh, and don't forget to unmute.
Are we good to go now? All right, thank you. We're all learning this as we go, aren't we? I've done probably 100 Zooms now, and I still forget to take the mute button off. But I'm taking my mask off too, because that was just a reminder that social distancing, masking, and voting, that's what we're really all about right now. Good morning and thank you. This is a privilege and honor, a delight for me to be able to speak to you. There are lots of challenges that we're all facing these days as educators, as citizens, as normal people. And it's just good to know that we are all in this together. By way of briefer introduction, or slightly briefer introduction, most of you know me as the author of Don't Know Much About History, Everything You Need to Know About American History But Never Learned, a book of questions and answers about American history. I hesitate to say this, but we just produced the 30th anniversary edition of Don't Know Much About History, which is astonishing to me that I have been doing this for 30 years. It doesn't even seem possible. But there we are. Of course, the book has been updated and expanded and revised over the years. This 30th anniversary edition has a preface called From the Era of Broken Trust to the Era of Broken Democracy. And it was written quite a while ago. And I had no idea, of course, when I wrote that, of how perilous the times would be. Certainly when I started out to write a book called Strongman, The Rise of 5 Dictators and the Fall of Democracy a few years ago, I also had no idea how perilous times would be. It was shocking to me, actually, a couple of days ago, I guess it was the day after the debate, to see headlines in the New York Times really talking about questions about the President of the United States, questioning the legitimacy of elections. And so I think that I'm sort of stunned, like many of you are, by what we have witnessed around us. And I think it's all the more important then to understand the story I'm going to talk to you about, we have this wonderful motto on the Washington Post, democracy dies in darkness. Well, I'm first of all here to tell you that that's not true at all. Democracy is often decapitated in broad daylight, often as millions of people cheer. And that's one of the most important lessons from this story that I tell in Strongman. Very briefly, it is the story of 5 of the most ruthless, murderous dictators in the 20th century. You know their names, but you may not know enough about them. Benito Mussolini of Italy, Adolf Hitler of Germany, of course, the Soviet Union's Joseph Stalin, Chairman Mao Zedong of China, and Saddam Hussein of Iraq. Some of these men's names have now been chiseled into that thing that we call history, and they've been mythologized, monsterized in some respects. And so what I have tried to do is tell their stories as real people. I have always said to all of my audiences, whether they are young adults or old adults, that history is about real people doing real things. And this is a story of real people doing unspeakable things to real people. And so it's really important to understand that it's very simple to reduce some of these men to just images or to call them monsters, but they are human beings. And of course, I must say right away that none of them could accomplish the things that they accomplished without many willing accomplices, officials, government leaders, bureaucrats, business owners, in many cases, the entire mass of the majority of the population, church leaders in some respects, and military leaders. So this is a very complicated story, but it is about how one man is able to accrue such power and exert such control over a nation and take it down such dangerous and deadly paths. It is a story for our time. We live in a moment in history when democracy is under assault around the world. It is under assault in the obvious places you've heard and read about: Russia under Putin, Hungary, Turkey, the Philippines, several nations in South America. So this is a rising tide of nationalism related to authoritarianism and then totalitarianism. We went through this period about in the early 90s where communism disappeared. The communist dictatorships in Eastern Europe fell away. The Soviet Union crumbled. It was unimaginable. At the same time, we saw apartheid end in South Africa. And people did have this hope for a new era of democracy, human rights, spreading freedoms around the world, globalization, improving the economies around the world to lift people to a new degree of freedom, prosperity, and peace. It lasted very short time. And so that is what we are facing today, and why I think the stories of these 5 men and what they did in their countries is so important to us in our time, especially when we are facing this crisis, as we all know it is, a crisis of civic engagement. I'm sure you are all aware, and it's being talked about at every level, and I've been talking about it for a couple of years through the National Council for the Social Studies about what we call the Sputnik moment. This moment where we're saying we need to understand this history to understand what's going on in the country today, and to understand that history and social studies and civics play such an important role in protecting our democracy. So I'll come back to that in a little bit in terms of what we should be doing as social studies educators, as history educators, to fix this very, very dangerous problem that is affecting, it's not a new problem, but it's certainly a more dangerous problem today than it ever has been before, in my opinion. So let me briefly go through the scenario. The other piece of the story in Strongman that I should mention is that I also offer a very, very quick overview of democracy as an idea. It's a word that we use all the time. It's a commonly used word that many people still don't understand or have a different connotation for. We hear people all the time saying, yes, we're a democracy, but we're really a republic. What's the difference between those things? It's a distinction without a real difference, if you ask me, but we'll come back to that as well. So I go back to the roots of democracy in ancient Greece, in the Roman Republic, which had tremendous impact on the future United States of America, because the founding fathers, for the most part, uniformly were very, very admiring of the Roman Republic. They thought that that was the pinnacle of where representative government had reached in history. They saw the United States of America as being a way to revive these ancient ideals of the Roman Republic. Of course, they took a somewhat romantic view of the Roman Republic. We know a little bit more now about the depths of the corruption and the intrigues in the Roman Republic, but that's a separate story. So it's no accident that they named the Senate the Senate. They were doing that in honor of the Roman Republic. But in talking about this idea of democracy, going back to Greece, going back to this idea that democracy is a Greek word that means the power of the people. And a republic comes from the Latin that also means of the people. So two similar ideas that are reflected today. But when you go back and look at Athens 2,500 years ago, and I quote Plato in this, he believed that democracy was not the best form of government. And he had even a more pessimistic view. He thought that democracy would ultimately end in tyranny, because democracy would be an ungovernable ideal that eventually a strongman, a dictator, a tyrant, in his words, would eventually come to pass. His ideal was that this would be a philosopher king, a benign tyrant who was well-educated and had the people's interests in mind. Of course, we know from history that has rarely been the case. So I then go through each of these five men and their stories and the similarities between these five men. What do they have in common? What practices, what techniques, what strategies, what did they use? I call it the strongman's playbook, and it is a playbook that all of them did use. And how has that been seen over the decades, and how can we see it going around the world today? And I start with Mussolini in part because he did come first. In many respects, he set the template for some of these other men. Certainly Hitler in Germany watched what Mussolini had done a decade earlier and replicated some of those things. So Benito Mussolini came to power just about 100 years ago. Important to realize that he was an elected member of the Italian legislature at the time. Italy was a constitutional monarchy when Mussolini was elected. It had been a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy since the middle of the 19th century, around 1861. So while we're having our civil war, Italy is actually having a very short-lived civil war and unites. It was a government that never quite got off the ground because of a lot of complicated situations in Italy, but the Italian government had never been a strong central government than nearly 60 years later. Of course, the intervening period is also World War I, and we can't talk about almost any of these men without talking about the significance of World War I in leading to some of these dictatorships. It's very, very clear that Mussolini, who was a World War I veteran, he'd been in the army, was wounded in a training exercise, very seriously wounded. He was hospitalized and had many surgeries, but it was a training exercise. But the experience of World War I clearly shaped Benito Mussolini. He became a very, very staunch nationalist. He became a very staunch militarist. And when Italy, after World War I was over, and Italy had been on the winning side, so to speak, was really denied any of the spoils of war. Mussolini took this as a reason for Italy to be insulted, set aside, to be seen as being downtrodden by the other powers of Europe. So this idea, first of all, of powerful nationalism, and the idea that other people are trying to keep us down, foreign influences are keeping us, this is central to Mussolini's appeal to the people of Italy, certainly responding to the economic, social, and political chaos in his country. So you have a man who says, I am going to fix this. Italy must return to greatness. He wants to restore Italy to the grandeur and the glory of ancient Rome. So all of these factors come into his threat, and it is an empty threat to march on Rome. And he does that in October of 1922. He announces he's going to have his men march on Rome. Many of them were former members of the Italian army, special forces known as the Arditi, and they wore black shirts. And that became the emblem of Mussolini's party, the black shirts. And they had another piece of their appeal was this idea of a strong military. And then they also adapted again as a hearkening back to ancient Rome. The symbol of ancient Rome was the fasces, which was a bundle of rods held together around an axe head. This was something that an official in Rome would carry as a symbol of leadership, a symbol of authority. The Italian fascists adopted this symbol as the symbol of bringing Italy together in unity and strength. And so this was the whole essence of what fascism is. Fascism is not like communism, socialism, capitalism in sense of having a philosophy. Its philosophy was really, we want power and we want the power to rule independent of any other outside rule, essentially one party rule. And it happened very, very quickly in Italy. Mussolini was able to gather a large group of followers around him. They did threaten this march on Rome. It actually didn't come off because before Mussolini could march on Rome, the king, who had the authority under the Constitution, called him up and offered to make him the prime minister. So Mussolini is essentially put into power. His fascist party is one of a number of political parties, not even the most powerful one. And very, very quickly, he moves to use every possible legal maneuver to consolidate power for the fascist party. They have elections that are riddled by fraud. Soon after, a senator gets up, one of the Italian opposition senators, and makes a speech about the fraudulent elections. He's kidnapped, taken away, disappeared, and found murdered a few weeks later. So this was a regime that was not afraid to use violence at any level. They quickly moved to institute loyalty oaths for people who were professors. All 1,200 university professors in Italy had to sign a loyalty oath to Mussolini. Of that 1,200, only 12 would not sign it, and those 12 were eventually deported from Italy. So these are the ways that he came to power legitimately, constitutionally, and quickly moved to suppress all opposition. All media was brought under fascist control. It had to be licensed. Every movie cinema, every movie theater in the country, before it could show a movie, had to show a piece of fascist newsreel, usually with Mussolini front and center, often in uniform or even bare-chested. Images of Vladimir Putin come to mind. So this was another piece of the strongman's tactics to create a cult of personality around this strong central leader. Mussolini quickly was able to adapt Italy into a one-party state. He did some things that were very popular: public works programs, massive public works programs to put people to work, militarization. So the army was very happy. They were getting new tanks and Navy vessels. And of course, one of the first things Mussolini does is also take his nation into war, because war is a good thing to bring the nation together, as we know from history. So all of these techniques were used, and Mussolini soon concentrates power and creates a fascist state that lasts for 20 years. It's as I mentioned, Hitler watches this for 10 years and emulates many of these techniques. Of course, Mussolini is eventually allied with Hitler, and it's interesting, historically, we think of him as the sort of second fiddle to Adolf Hitler, that he was sort of in Hitler's shadow. But early on, Mussolini was by far the more prominent world leader. And many people around the world were very happy with Mussolini doing what he did, because his chief opponent was the socialists and the communists. This was the period of the Great Fear, because the Russian Revolution had taken place. People feared the spread of communism. And that's why the Vatican was very happy to sign on with Mussolini and became an ally. That's why most of the business interests in Italy, the industrialists and shopkeepers of Italy, were very happy. They did not want to see socialism or communism on Russian Soviet style come into Italy. So he was able to use that as the common enemy, another key technique of the strongman. Of course, Mussolini's relationship with Hitler eventually ends with his being deposed first, and then eventually captured and executed by partisan fighters in Italy during World War II. Of course, we go on to Hitler after Mussolini. Like Mussolini, Hitler was working and coming to power in a constitutional democracy. The Weimar Republic, created in 1919 after World War I. Again, the importance of World War I can't be overstated here in terms of all of these nations. The Weimar Republic in 1919 had a constitution that was one of the most progressive of its kind in the world. It was ahead of the United States and Great Britain in many respects. It gave women the vote before either Great Britain or the United States did. It provided for workers' protections that wouldn't be available in the United States for many years to come. It provided a degree of religious freedom to the degree that Russian and Jews from other parts of Europe were actually coming to Germany because they thought it would be a safer place for them because there were religious protections put in place. Of course, Hitler is a member of a legal party, the National Socialist Party, the Nazis. He runs for president, finishes second to Paul von Hindenburg, a famous World War I general. And although he's not a member of the legislature, the Nazis are the second most powerful party in Germany. Like Italy, Germany is fractured in the post-war period, economic chaos, the tremendous debt load that had been put on them from the Treaty of Versailles, unemployment, a country that had been devastated by war and the Spanish flu. I've talked about this in More Deadly Than War, my previous book. So the conditions were also ripe in Germany for someone to come along and take this chaos and say, I alone can fix this. And Hitler was the man who entered that vacuum. Again, he is appointed chancellor, equivalent of prime minister in Germany, and given powers, but they really thought he's not a very impressive person. We can kind of manipulate and control him. people in Italy thought the same thing about Mussolini. It's an interesting idea. They think about these people as somewhat weak and a puppet that they can manipulate for their own uses. And in both cases, of course, it turned out to be just the opposite. In the case of Hitler, and I described this in the very first chapter in the book, there is a crisis that comes about because the Reichstag, the German parliament building, is set on fire. This was a young man was captured in the building. There has always been mysteries around the circumstances of his presence there and his arrest. But this young man is a Dutchman who claims that he was a member of the Communist Party. Hitler uses this as a way to say the communists did this. This was part of a plan to overthrow our government. And they enact what was known as the Reichstag decree. And this gave Hitler near dictatorial powers almost immediately. He's able to shut down the press. He's able to ban other political parties, including the communists. He's able to institute a series of arrests around the country, some extra legal. And there was certainly beatings and murders as a result of that. Barely a month later, he's given a further piece of legislation now that he's in control of the Reich, the Reichstag, which really cements Hitler's power completely, makes the Nazi Party a single party, and then that's followed by the death of President von Hindenburg, and Hitler essentially decrees that the presidency no longer exists, and he declares himself to be the Führer. And so once again, it wasn't overnight, but it was very quick. And it certainly wasn't in darkness. This was all done out in the open, semi-legally, and again with millions of people, certainly thousands of people cheering eagerly for Hitler to say, we will make Germany great again. We've been pushed down because of the foreigners, the communists, and of course the Jews. So this is again the beginning of the roots of the strongman's techniques for taking power. Hitler also again begins this cult of personality. So soon his picture, his image is everywhere, along with the swastika image. These are very, very powerful techniques. Both men clearly understood one of the most important aspects of their ability was propaganda. To give people the big lie and keep repeating the big lie. We would call it fake news today. They understood this very, very well. Propaganda was part of their entire governing approach. So again, it's very important to understand and to look back how this happened step by step, because it enables us in a way to guard against it, to vaccinate ourselves against it, if we are aware of these situations. Now, the third story is that of, and of course, the chapter on Hitler carries through to the end of his life, the end of World War II, his eventual suicide as the Soviet Union is pressing in on Berlin. And that brings us to the next of the 5 strongmen, Joseph Stalin. Stalin was born in Georgia, then a semi-autonomous region of Tsarist Russia. Now it became a Soviet republic. Now it is once again an independent state. Again, they come to power in chaos and confusion. Stalin, of course, is a disciple of Lenin. He attaches himself to Lenin. The Russian Revolution takes place. Stalin is very good at finding ways to get allies, to put important allies in certain places. And once Lenin is off the scene, Lenin has a stroke, Stalin is able to essentially take over and purge all of his potential rivals, throwing Trotsky most famously out of the country. Trotsky goes to Mexico, where he's eventually assassinated by Stalin's agents. So these are all of the tools, the ruthlessness, the purges, the loyalty oaths, the elevation, Stalin quickly moved to make himself the face of this. And then unspeakable crimes against humanity. Long before World War II and the privations of World War II, Stalin moved to take over the Ukraine and created a situation where millions of Ukrainians were starved to death. It is considered the Ukrainian Holocaust, chapter in history that most people have never heard of. But this is the way he was able to destroy an entire nation, essentially, and make it one of the Soviet satellite nations. Again, the use of propaganda, the use of secret police, the use of turning people against a common enemy. At first, it was the capitalists of the world and the industrialists of the world, and then it was the counter-revolutionaries. Brilliant, but complete and utter barbarity and ruthlessness in his ability to eliminate enemies individually, but also in mass numbers. The fourth story, again, a story of a leader coming into a communist situation. And again, I always go back in each of these stories and trace the roots of this to early 20th century world politics. You can't separate these things out from each other. Mao Zedong is born the son of a fairly prosperous farmer. He is a kind of boy who doesn't really know what he's doing with himself. He goes to school. He's bullied because he's seen when he goes to school as a kind of a peasant, a kind of a hick, we might say. He's from the country. He goes to a big city where he's belittled and bullied by his schoolmates. That's not to suggest that bullying in school makes a dictator. I don't want to jump to those simple conclusions, but he's coming into his adolescence at a time when the Chinese Empire, which had existed for centuries as this dynasty, and of course, thousands of years, was falling apart. There was a republican movement in China. There is this great outbreak of democracy around the world in the early 20th century. And for one brief moment, China becomes a republic under Dr. Sun Yat-sen. It lasts very little time. Eventually, warring factions take over, nationalists versus communists, and this is complicated by Japan taking over. But Mao Zedong is a brilliant leader in terms of recognizing the power of the peasantry in China. And he mobilizes literally millions of peasants to become the heart of the Chinese communist revolution. And in 1949, he declares the People's Republic of China. Again, the catalog of abuses, mass starvation, programs to create a modern industrial state that are completely ruthless are the same techniques that Stalin had used once before. Finally, we come to the name that many of us are a little bit more familiar with, perhaps. The others are historic names, but we've lived through Saddam Hussein. Most of us lived through Saddam Hussein's reign. While he's not a killer on the same level in terms of numbers as these men, he was certainly as ruthless and willing to use any techniques possible to accumulate power and then to extend that power. And of course, eventually it leads to his being the war against Iraq, two wars against it, the first one in 1991 and later on under George W. Bush, finally ends the reign of Saddam Hussein. But it was a reign of terror. And in fact, he was a true student of Stalin. His library was filled with books about Stalin. He was known as Stalin, the Stalin of the Euphrates. So all of these men in each step looked back to their predecessors. And that's why I think it's so important to really see them and the commonalities in their techniques, in their approaches, in the way they acquired power, and then maintained power with such deadly, deadly results over a long period of history. This brings us, of course, to the present, and the fact that, and I want to mention quite specifically here, that the book nowhere mentions the current administration. This is not a book about America right now, but it is certainly a book about that asks, what kind of democracy do we want to have? What would we be willing to die for? When the founders write those words, we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. That was not pretty poetry. They were essentially saying we would die for our freedoms. And so it's a book that eventually asks, what would we be willing to sacrifice for? What would we die for? Family, faith, friends, freedom. These are really important questions that I think a lot of us who grew up in the past 50 years in America, some of us even longer, took this for granted that this idea would always be there. But we are at a moment when that seems more tentative than ever before. And so I don't take this lightly, and I've always been a fairly optimistic person, both as a citizen, as an American, even as a historian who recognizes that progress has been painfully slow, but we have made progress. In the past few decades, that progress has been sharply reversed in many respects, economically, politically, around the world. And that's why I think it's such an important moment to think about this past and really place ourselves very much in the present with an eye towards the future of where are we going from here? Is this the last best hope on earth? Will this be the more perfect union? Or do we go to the frightening world that George Orwell predicted in 1984, a world of 3 warring superpowers constantly at war, in which truth and objective reality has been thrown down the memory hole? So that's the kind of questions I leave at the end of this book for readers to answer. And again, the book is written for young adults. However, I think that many, many older adults will be intrigued and perhaps pricked to think about questions that we might have taken for granted for too long. So I've talked longer than I wanted to, and I would really love to hear from you, because this was meant to be a conversation and not a lecture. So please fire away if you have some questions there for me.
Yes, so we got a couple of questions, and I actually just allowed everyone to unmute themselves. So what I'll do is I will ask the participant who wrote a question, and if you wanted to, personally ask Ken a question, all you have to do is just press the space key or the space bar on your keyboard, and that will allow you to unmute. So I will ask Tom if you wanted to ask the question, or I can read it from the chat, but I figured give you an opportunity to talk to Ken if you like.
Thank you, Gorman. Hi, Mr. Davis. I was curious, do you think there is one characteristic that all 5 leaders share in common? What would it be?
It's a really good question, but I don't think it's one. I actually have what I call the Strongman's Playbook in the back. And I guess the question is, are you talking about personal characteristics or techniques that they use? Because those are similar but different ideas. Certainly, if we're talking about personal characteristics, all of these men, and I am not a psychologist or a behaviorist by training, I'm a historian reading some of the same things that you can read, but all of these men would have been characterized and have been characterized as malignant narcissists. And that's, a word that's been tossed around a lot lately. What does that mean? It means they were essentially unfeeling, unsympathetic people, completely concerned about themselves and no one else, and their entire being is dedicated towards their self-interest and self-aggrandizement with the complete absence of conscience that that malignant narcissist implies. So when you look at each of these men and the remarkable depths of cruelty that they were able to go to, and there's definitely a scale here. Mussolini is at probably the low end of the scale, and then you go on to Stalin, Hitler, Saddam Hussein, certainly as people who were willing and kind of took delight in the torture of their enemies and opponents. So I guess from a personal characteristic perspective, that's the one that would jump out on me. As I mentioned, they all were very, very capable. And I don't know if it's instinctive or intuitive, or they did see what others were doing, but they understood the techniques of intense nationalism, creating this image of a country that was once great and had been downtrodden, and we must build it back up again, and I'm the one who can do this. The turning against a common enemy, whether it was immigrants or Jews or foreigners or the banks or whatever that is, the industrialists for the communists, the wealthy landowners for the communist Chinese, the ability to find some common enemy that people would unite against, and then use propaganda to not only make that person seem bad, but to make them seem evil and subhuman enough that eventually you can murder them on a mass scale. So those are some of the techniques, the use of propaganda, the use of this personality cult, making the individual the representative of the state. And it's interesting to go back historically, and I tell this in the book, that one of the things that really got the Roman Senate nervous, they had given Julius Caesar power. They made him dictator first for 10 years and then dictator for life. They got really nervous when he put his own image on the coins, because that was one step away from deification. And you see this in all these other men. They put their images all over the place. Saddam Hussein's name was all over Iraq. He put it on the names of mosques or airports or roads. The other technique that's very, very significant, especially in talking to students, is the creation of a generation of loyal children who are really indoctrinated, brainwashed, you could say, into the belief of this figure as being representative of the country. So Mussolini had Balilla. In Germany, there's the Hitler Youth. In the Soviet Union, there's the pioneers, the young communists. Same thing in China. Eventually, it becomes the Red Guard. Saddam Hussein has the same thing, creating an entire generation of children who are indoctrinated into this belief of this man as not only the leader, but the epitome of what the country believes. So those are all really significant techniques that we should be on the watch for.
Thank you.
All right, we have a question from Craig. Do you want me to read it, or you can just press the space bar and you can ask the question directly to Ken?
I'm happy to do so. Thanks, Gorman. I was curious about the term populism and when populism may go too far, or is there something really different about populism versus, the rise of some fascist or dictatorial or authoritarian regime?
It's a really good question, Craig. Thank you very much. Is it Craig? Is that right?
Yes, sir.
It's a really good question, and I actually address it in the book through two guys who have written about this whole notion of populism and when populism goes to authoritarianism, what's the steps? I put it this way: not all nationalists are populists, or not all populists are authoritarians, but all authoritarians eventually are populist nationalists in there. So it's a first step in almost all of these stories towards the accumulation of power in the individual. The idea of the populace, that I am speaking for the downtrodden man who's not getting anything, they all had that as part of their regimen, as part of their appeal. Certainly Hitler did. Mussolini did. He was speaking to the downtrodden Italian masses, and maybe at some point in their lives they believed that there was something to be done there. But it's clear that these men all saw it and took it as a route to the accumulation of personal power, and not the realization of a populist dream. I guess the best contrast I can come up with to illustrate this is that, the United States had many of the same economic and social ills that Italy and Germany had, perhaps not to the degree until the Great Depression comes. But Italy turns to Mussolini, Germany turns to Hitler, and the United States gets a populist of sorts in Franklin D. Roosevelt. Very, very different. And that's kind of one of the points of the book as well, is that what's been exceptional about America up until now is that even in our worst crises, the American Civil War and the Great Depression leading into World War II, this country has never turned to a strong man. In fact, in those two crises, we've gotten two of our greatest presidents, in Abraham Lincoln and Franklin D. Roosevelt. So is that something about the American system, the American character, or American idealism? I don't know. That's an interesting subject to explore. But we certainly did not go the strongman route, which these other countries did. But there's no question that they began their political appeal to the nation as nationalists and populists. But very often, I think you can say that eventually these are just means to an end. Certainly, Hitler did believe that he wanted to make Germany great again, and that it was a superior nation and it would lift up the German people, but he was going to do it at the expense of all of the other people that he thought were subhuman. And that's where we get into a very different territory. It's a great question, though. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you. Question from Tom. Would you like to ask Ken directly? Okay, maybe not. So Tom's question was, any comment about US-backed dictators around the world?
In this book particularly, or just in general? I don't know. I don't talk too much about support for dictators. Certainly, when we get into the territory of each of these men that I focus on had relationships with the United States in different ways. Mussolini was seen as quite a great, potentially great leader by Americans and British leadership, again because of the fear of Bolshevism and communism spreading in Europe. They thought Mussolini would be a staunch opponent who would maintain democratic capitalism. And so he had certainly the support early on of some American governments until he started going into Africa, particularly using poison gas in the wars against Africans, first in Libya and later in what we now call Ethiopia. I guess the most complicated one, not in terms of support for a dictator, but in terms of an alliance, is that for a long time, the Soviet Union was our ally in World War II. And I grew up in a time, of course, after World War II, during the Cold War, where the Soviet Union was the great bugaboo now. And it was the role of the Soviet Union in World War II was really left out of my school books. We did not want to make the case that Joseph Stalin was really as much responsible for the defeat of Nazi Germany as Winston Churchill and FDR were. That is a fact of history, perhaps more so in some respects. So that's been part of the history that I talk about here. Look, in post-war America, there's a long list of people who were not democratic at all that the United States supported, usually because of communism. We can look at the Philippines, Marcos. We can look at Iran, the support for the Shah that eventually leads to the Iranian Revolution. These are things that I've talked about a little bit more in Don't Know Much About History over the years, as opposed to this book. But sure, the United States was professing to be the source of democracy and the proponent of democracy around the world for all of those years after World War II and during the Cold War, while actively supporting some pretty vicious and horrible dictators in many countries around the world, usually in the cause of anti-communism. So that's part of it's part of the U.S. history that I don't really get into too much in this book, Strongman, but it's a really, really rich and important subject that we should think about. Thanks for that question.
All right, great. Anthony Melvin, do you want to unmute and you want to ask Ken a question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, so based on your research, what do you think would be our playbook to kind of inoculate ourselves against the development of our own strongman or dictator?
It's a really good question and a really important question. And as I said, when I started this conversation 45, almost 55 minutes ago, I didn't think that when we planned this, that the New York Times headline would read that the president is not committed to upholding the results of the election. It's an astonishing thing to see on in the pages of the New York Times. So certainly unprecedented in my lifetime of watching history, and I can't think of any moment in all of American history. Maybe the election of 1800 kind of got into that territory, but very, very different circumstances. So what do we inoculate what do we have to do to vaccinate ourselves? I think that first of all, this understanding of how these men do come to power and with willing accomplices and the techniques that they use. And I've outlined, quite a few of them already in this conversation, the hyper-nationalism, the populism, the turning on one group as the enemy, whether it's immigrants or a particular religious group, and we've certainly had that in the past 4 years. So that's on the table right now. I think what frightens me most and is most important to inoculate ourselves against is the notion of false news, and specifically how it's being manipulated during these elections. The question of how social media has transformed the political landscape is probably the most important lesson of our time. We as adults are still trying to sort through it all. And I think that that makes it all the more important that we help our students sort through that and understand the importance of accurate, documented information and reliable sources. I mean, and I have to say that right now, today, since we're in this realm of confusion and chaos about even the president's health, it makes it all the more difficult to make that case to kids. But I think it's the most important thing that we can do as educators is really teach students, as we're learning ourselves, how to be careful consumers of information in this information overload era that we find ourselves in? It's a really important and good question, and I wish we could spend, maybe an hour just talking about that sometime.
All right, we have a question from Allison. Allison, would you like to ask Ken directly?
Well, the question, if we are limited on time, I will defer to the question that follows mine, which is more interesting.
Well, okay. Yeah,
I wanted to hear her question.
Go ahead. Go for
Oh,
it.
I'll ask my question quickly, which is whether you would think each of the societies shaped by the strongmen you cover in your book would meet the definition of fascist.
That's a good question. And, the thing about fascism as a ism is that it really exists for the power of the state, the power of this person to have power. That was, Orwell says the point of power is power. And I think that's in a way the simplest definition of fascism. So they were all fascist in a way because they were creating states in which the power was the ultimate end for these men. You get the complication with that is, certainly the way they, the ends to which they were using that power, whether it was communism as a means for world domination. And certainly that was, Stalin's idea was international, the workers of the world unite. Of course, not necessarily to improve the lot of workers, but to accrue more power to Stalin and the Soviet Union. So if we reduce fascism to this kind of simple definition that this is a one-party state in which the goal is to accrue power for the purpose, for the sake of power, yes, they were all fascists in that respect. I think they have ultimately different designs in some respects, but that was what ties them all together. So it's a good and fair question. Thank you.
Yeah. Lamerci has shown up. Hi, Lamerci. Would you like to ask Ken your question?
Yes.
All right, great.
They have ultimately different designs in some respects, but that was what
Oh,
ties
you're
them.
watching on Facebook Live, so it's a little.
Oh, okay. I'm hearing myself and I'm not talking yet.
Lamerci has shown up. Hi, Lamerci. Would you like to ask Ken your question?
Yes. First of all,
Yes.
thank you
Great, great.
for your great analysis. Comparatively, I really have loved it. I'm a student of political science philosophy and taking courses on totalitarianism. One of the questions I had was from Hannah Arendt in Origins of Totalitarianism, and how she gives this idea that the phenomena that you speak of as strongman has been working for thousands of years in some way or another, that this is something in the milieu of power and how you get it and what you do with it. So I really wanted to say that I appreciate your delineation of these things. And now, what do you see with respect to that? How we are defining where we're going in America.
Could you mute your, because there's a
That's
delay.
somebody-
I'm kind of
that's not me.
hearing.
Oh, I see.
I'm hearing a disembodied voice at the same time I'm listening to you. Thank you. And thank you for that question. These are really great questions. And by the way, Gorman, I see we're past noon. That's okay with me. I don't know if you guys are on a tight schedule. I'm happy to talk as long as you'll have me. I mentioned in the very beginning of my talk that Plato discusses this in the Republic when he discusses the different forms of government. And he does not think that democracy is the best and that democracy will eventually give way to a tyrant. He didn't necessarily think that a tyrant had the same connotation that we have as a malevolent character, a tyrant in the sense of a single strong leader, a strong man. So yes, this has been something throughout history. You go back to some of the great figures in history, and we think of, and they are strongmen. Alexander the Great is the essential strongman in a sense, a somewhat benighted one in some respects because he wanted to bring what he thought was Greek culture to the rest of the world, but it was still in his pursuit of personal power. Julius Caesar, I have discussed already as the quintessential strongman in some respects, coming in, believing that Rome is in chaos, that the Senate is corrupt, which it was, believing that he needs to clean up the mess, and marches his troops into Rome to do that. And then quickly after that begins to accrue to himself not only political and personal and military power, but something greater. By putting his picture on the coins, he wants to take the next step towards deification. So throughout history, this idea of the strong man has been a powerful one. And it's very important, I'm going to say, in the context of this book, and I spend a chapter talking about it, because the founding fathers understood this perhaps more than any other thing. And so when they are debating the presidency, the thing they fear is that they are creating somebody like this, especially by making him commander in chief. And that's one of the reasons that they were so loath to create an army, a meaningful army. There was really no army for George Washington to command. There was about 800 men in the US Army. They were opposed to a standing army because they did not believe that it was safe to give one man command of a standing army, because they thought they'll just march in someday and that will be the end of the republic. So when we look at the constitutional debates and we talk about the executive powers and the checks that they were going to put on the executive and this idea of balance of powers, it is really one of the most important animating ideas to the founding fathers, especially to somebody like Madison, taking this idea that had been put forth by Montesquieu of this balance of powers. And even Benjamin Franklin said, look, we know that the first man at the helm will be a good one. He was talking, of course, about George Washington, who's sitting there in front of the room as they're talking about the president. He says, he'll be a good one. We just don't know what's coming next. We're on our way to an elected monarchy. And that's the thing they feared more than anything else. They had seen this throughout history. Very few years, of course, after the United States comes together and France has its rebellion, a strong man comes along to eliminate the chaos in Napoleon. So I'm sure that Americans were, casting their eye across at Napoleon, saying, "Yeah, see, that's exactly what we didn't want." So this has always been the tension in any government, whether it's parliamentary or a democracy of some sort, that once you allow such powers to accrue to one man, it becomes very dangerous. We look back at Franklin D. Roosevelt really trying to gain some more of those powers for himself by coming up with this plan, for instance, to change the Supreme Court. And the Congress and the people really pushed back on that. So that's another instance, I guess, of what makes American exceptional with respect to strongman. But it was, there's no question that we really do have to. I'm not a prophet. My fear right now is that we are on the wrong path towards more authoritarianism around the world, and certainly many people in this country seem more comfortable with that idea. than I would have thought true 20 or 30 years ago. My views on that have changed a great deal. So I think that is why we, if we care about this idea of the last best hope on earth and a more perfect union, we have to take these threats very seriously.
Okay, so I have one question, and this will be the final question. So we got a few time, a few more minutes. So basically, my initial thoughts was democracy is never secure, right? So two questions. It's a two-parter. Beyond the Constitution, what factors do you believe are critical or essential to prevent autocratic rule in the United States? And the second part, if there was an opportunity to amend the Constitution, and given our recent observations and experiences, because a lot of people do feel like we're heading towards in that direction, but what amendment or amendments would you like to see, or would you think would be proposed or replaced to secure democracy from potential autocracy?
Really good questions. Again, I think we could do an hour on those two questions easily. So I'll give you kind of my quick list. Let me take the second part first, because I think there are some very practical, immediate things that we can do that don't involve changing the Constitution. Certainly making voting more accessible, easier, voter friendly than it is today. And of course, that's a major debate right now, where you have, to be frank, one party sort of putting up as many obstacles to people voting as possible, suppressing vote. We know this, and the long history of gerrymandering. Add to that the Citizens United, which allows this flood of money to come in over the political system. So those have been really structural problems that we've had for a long time that I think need to be addressed. Simply making, Election Day a holiday, making mail-in voting more accessible, as many states have already done without any difficulties in terms of fraud or lost ballots. So we know how to do this. It's really the political will to do it. And when one party seems to be opposed to that fundamental idea, that makes it more difficult. I think in terms of changing the Constitution, I personally am opposed to the Electoral College. I think it is a vestige of, some late 18th century, early 19th century political thought that we are long past. If it had a legitimate reason 230 odd years ago, I think that those legitimate reasons have largely been replaced. I think it's very, very dangerous that for most of 200 years, the popular vote was in line with the electoral vote, with a couple of curious exceptions. The fact that we've had two presidential elections in 16 years in which the popular winner did not become president is a very disturbing trend. So I'm completely at home with the notion of getting rid of the Electoral College. I think it's outlived its usefulness. There are ways to get rid of it without amending the Constitution. There is this legislation that's going around the country called the National Popular Vote Act, in which each state agrees that it will give its electors to whoever wins the national popular vote. Once you get to the point at which 270 states with 270 electors sign on to that, it would essentially replace the Electoral College. We're not there yet, but I do think that's a realistic thing. To the first part of the question, I think it's really, really important to understand, obviously, registering everyone to vote, making sure people understand the importance of voting. And I think as historians, one of the most important things to do with respect to that is really make people understand that the tremendous sacrifice, the loss, lives, blood, sweat, and tears that went into winning this right to vote. To me, going to the polling place, I remember being taken as a kid by my parents. We thought it was this, kind of really sacred thing. And I think we've lost that to some respect. And I think that's a part of what we have to teach as history, as part of our responsibility as citizens that go along with our rights. Along with that, I think that the most important thing, and certainly the most important thing I tell young people, is even if you don't vote, you must make your voice heard. Kids, not all kids can vote. I couldn't vote when I was 14. I could vote when I was 18. The law changed back then. But when I was 14, 15, and 16, I could still write a letter to the newspaper, which I did. I got my first published thing in my life was a letter to the newspaper about the schools were trying to cut sports out. Yes, you know, it's been happening for a long time. So I wrote a letter and it got published. A few years later, I walked out of school in the moratorium against the Vietnam War. That was a pretty radical thing in its day. So I think that students should understand that they have a voice that goes beyond voting, calling congressmen, writing letters, marching with protest signs, walking out of school, if they were in school, are all part of our responsibility. And this is part of the history as well, that most of the changes in our country have come from the bottom up, not the top down. And a lot of those have come from people who had a voice but no vote. Women who changed suffrage laws, people who changed the civil rights laws and the voting laws to allow Black Americans, first of all, to vote, and then eventually to vote more freely and safely. So those are things that we have to understand, and I think we have to teach very carefully in history class. We can't make civics just about how a bill becomes law. We have to make it about, this is your right, your responsibility, and democracy is not a spectator sport. As John Lewis just said, democracy is an act, it's not a state. And so we have to remember, it's a verb. We have to keep working at it. I probably have talked too much and gone on too long, but it was a pleasure. And I, first of all, in closing, want to say thank you to you guys, because I know I've talked to a lot of teachers. I know how hard it is, what we're all going through. I know you are doing your absolute best under extraordinary circumstances. So I'm so grateful for you. I wish that you would get the support, backing, encouragement you need, instead of the sniping and the criticism that teachers often get. And in me, you have somebody who supports you and has your back. So I hope you realize that. Along those lines, on a very simple level, if you go to my website, don'tknowmuch.com, I offer virtual visits to classrooms, limited number, and there's an educators button there, and you can find out. I think Gorman's going to share that out. And finally, on October 20th, I'm going to do a student town hall meeting and talk about some of these things with students, with the National Council for Social Studies. And we are actually actively seeking students to submit, videos beforehand. And I think Gorman's going to share that link out with you as well. If you want your kids to get involved in an interesting night of hearing their voices and what they're thinking about and what their concerns are, it'd be a great chance for them to take part in this National Students Town Hall. So with that, all that said, thank you again for listening. Strongman is out now, as is Don't Know Much About History, the 30th anniversary edition. And I hope we get to do this in person again someday soon.
Thank you, Ken, very much. This was great. It's a great way to kick off NERCVirtual, and hopefully everyone, I'm sure everyone appreciated your insights and just your expert knowledge. If you go to our website and you go to the NERCVirtual program, and Ken's page is still open, his email address is there, so you can feel free to email Ken any questions that you have, or go to the link to the town hall. I think he also has his Twitter. It's Twitter, right? Kenneth C. Davis.
Kenneth's at Kenneth C. Davis is the Twitter handle, and it's largely a teacher. I'll be doing, by the way, SS Chat. I'll be moderating on October 19th. We'll be talking about some of these same things again. If you're not familiar with Twitter, or if you're on Twitter but don't know SS Chat, I would highly recommend it. Talk to your colleagues around the country and around the world, and sharing resources. It's every Monday night at 7 p.m. Eastern time, a Twitter chat. A lot of great resources, a lot of great people, and just always good to know that there are other people out there with the same concerns.
Great. Thank you again. Be sure to fill out the evaluation. I put the link in the chat. You can wait until you've gone through all the keynote sessions, and then you can do the feedback survey, or you can just, do a feedback survey each time. I kind of left that open for people because sometimes, their memory is fresh and they just want to put in their responses. So feel free to please provide your feedback. So that is it for this session. Again, thank you, Ken. And thank you everyone for joining on a Sunday morning. And hopefully I'll be able to see you in our other keynote sessions later today and tomorrow afternoon. All right. And don't forget to vote. All right. Thank
Mask,
you.
vote, social distance, hand washing.
Washing, exactly. All right. Thank you.